Hello friends, back again with another vlog, and I figured I would kick this one off by firing up some coffee and chatting about one of the stranger books I've read so far this year. So some of you will remember that earlier this year I read a collection from the contemporary Russian writer Vladimir Sorokin called Dispatches from the District Committee. Very strange work, to say the least. Obscene, sexual, perverse, disgusting stories, but also very provocative and yet engaging still. I wrote a thorough review on my Substack. And, you know, he's had a lot of praise over his other works, many of them published by New York Review of Books. And right now I'm reading another collection of his short stories called Red Pyramid. I also have Goluboy Sala, which is Blue Lard, that I plan on reading this year, Teluria. I recently read Ochirits, or The Queue, about a month ago. I didn't really enjoy that. Maybe I'll talk about that in a future kind of wrap-up video. But, you know, I'm 3 stories into this book, and it's already disgusting and strange, yet still stimulating. I was actually chatting with one of my frequent language partners I practice with, a Russian native named Anton, and he's somewhat of a fan of Sorokin, at least stylistically. He thinks it's interesting, and we were chatting about how all of Sorokin's stories, they start off and you're like, okay, it's this mother and daughter, they're going to, it could be anything, they're going to the store, it's this family in an apartment, oh, they're visiting a monument. And then there's a stark, a really sharp turn basically in these stories. A character suddenly unzips their pants, they go off in the woods, they start describing something, and immediately the story takes this, again, crazy sharp turn. And that's so far how these 3 stories have been. They've essentially, all of them have involved feces and these very repulsive acts. But again, there's a lot of not just satire mixed within these stories, but criticism. And sometimes it's hard for me to really pick it out because as much as I am a Slavophile and consume a lot of Russian history and culture and read a lot of Russian books, the post-Stalin but still Soviet era is a portion of Russian history that I'm not super well versed in. And so I was talking to Anton about it, and he was explaining, a lot of the meaning and context surrounding whether it's Ochirits or whether it's, essentially why there's this frequent use of feces in a lot of Sorokin stories is because he views this mythologizing of Russian history fed to you by the authorities, government, as being fed a pile of shit, basically. Pardon my French. But basically that a lot of Russian citizens, the children, whatever it is, they're being fed lies, they're being fed bullshit. And that's what a lot of these stories are kind of satirically and in some ways literally providing you in these stories. So, I don't fully know what to make of this collection. Like I said, I'm only 3 stories in, but it's set a certain tone. But I'm reading this book, I just started it yesterday, and then the primary novel I'm reading is Pyotr I, or Peter the First, by Alexey Tolstoy. And I'll tell you more about that after this finishes brewing. And actually, before I talk about Pyotr I do want to make one more note just to kind of add on or clarify what I meant by mythologizing the past. So this isn't exclusive to Russia. Every country has their own myths and iconical figures and stories, famous battles and heroes. And it's not that these events didn't happen or these figures didn't exist. So it's not mythologizing in that sense of the term. But more that these certain figures or events are used as a vehicle to craft a narrative about cultural identity, national identity, the history of a certain country and of a people. And that's what Sorokin is kind of criticizing here, because when that goes too far, it goes too extreme, or it's working in the direction of a certain agenda of a country or some nationalistic leader, then it can lead to chaos and murderous campaigns and all sorts of things like that. But every country crafts their own narrative of history and sheds a light more on certain portions of the country's history and kind of dims the light, or it turns a blind eye to other parts of a country or a nation's history. So anyway, that's generally what I meant by some of Sorokin's overarching criticism that extends far beyond this work. And then the other novel I've been working on, it's much longer, a little bit under 800 pages, is Peter the First, Pyotr Первый. And this is by Alexey Tolstoy, so not the Tolstoy that most of you are probably familiar with, Lев Tolstoy, famous for, of course, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and the like. This is, I believe he's a distant relative, so I think he's maybe a distant nephew, distant cousin, something like that. Of course, has a last name. But either way, this is a novel that was really popular in its day. I can't speak to how popular it is in Russia today, but it did get a few prints here in America. This edition actually comes from 1959, and it's a gorgeous edition. The dust jacket on this, I think, is beautiful. You have the Russian, I believe it's called crest, kind of imprinted on there. I'm not sure if you can see it on the front. Gorgeous little lettering, gold lettering on the spine. A nice map on the inside. It's a very pretty edition, kept in great condition considering how old it is. And I haven't made much of a dent in it. I'm about 150 pages in. It is a long story. And based on the title of the novel, you can probably guess what it's about. It's about Peter the Great, one of the most influential czars in Russian history, if not the most influential. The one who really kicked off the designs and plans for the city of St. Petersburg, the man and the leader of Russia who really pushed further their innovation, their industry, their naval capabilities. He really westernized Russia, which Russia at the time was in much need of modernization, and he ushered in this new wave of innovation and technology and education as well. Even switched over their calendar system. All these things happened under his reign. So for that reason, it also introduced order of rank, which if you've read about, titular counselors and all these different societal positions and ranks in different Dostoevsky novels and things like that, that's, partly where it all comes from. So for that reason, it's like a historical fiction. The interesting aspect, well, there's two interesting facts about this novel, and then I'll shut up and get to reading, is one, it's unfinished. So Tolstoy was working on this for years and years, and I think he passed away before he could finish it. And then the other part about this novel is that it was written with the aim of drawing certain parallels between Peter the Great and Joseph Stalin. So there is some propaganda kind of intertwined into this, although so far it's not obvious, and I think it's probably very much faint or in the background of this novel. It mainly centers around Peter the Great's life and his childhood up through his reign and all the really consequential events that surround his reign and his life. But that is something to kind of keep in mind, that there is this current underlying the novel, I guess, that was, again, a natural piece of Soviet propaganda of the time. So with all that said, I'm going to get to reading, and I'll update you later. Just finished up reading, and there's two things I have to say about Sorokin's style that I very much admire. One is that he has this kind of rebellious tone that underlies, I feel like, a lot of his stories. And then the other thing I'd say, and it ties back to my point I mentioned when I was brewing coffee, was that his stories always have, at least pretty much always have, this abruptness about them, where the story is going in one direction, and then there is this harsh, abrupt turn that you could not have predicted otherwise. And even though I don't always grasp the exact kind of message or meaning that he's trying to convey in the stories, I'm unavoidably interested. It's unavoidably and unmistakably entertaining. That's one thing that you will not fail to appreciate about Sorokin's writing, is you're not going to be bored. You might be appalled, you might be repulsed at different times, and it probably won't work for you. I don't think I'm the most ideal writer for Sorokin's work, but I will say I'm always entertained. I'm always entertained and intrigued by what's being written. And as far as that kind of dichotomy or schism, perhaps you could say, between, a first and second half of a story, I was talking about that with Anton, and he said, and this is something that's just hard to come across over translation, is that he'll do this where he'll write in a style, a certain style in the first half of a story that might be, it sounds like Turgenev, or it sounds like Tolstoy, or it sounds like something more traditional. And then it switches. And that's something that's hard to pick up within the English. And I wonder, years down the line when I have the fluency and skill level to read higher level Russian stories, I'm interested to see that because it doesn't really come across in English. I think the only thing that comes across is when there's a very explicit action where you're like, where the hell is this story going? But that's enough of my rambling. Sorokin, as some of you know, if you watched a video a few months ago, I plan on doing a larger project around him as I did around Laszlo Krasznahorkai. And this project is going to take a while, not only because there's more works that I'm examining, I'm kind of looking at his entire catalog or backlist rather than just looking at a quartet as I did with the Hungarian writer. But also there's just a lot to digest. There's a lot I need to kind of understand contextually with him. So it'll take me a while, I think, before I can confidently make some sensible assessment of his work and his style. But anyway, this is going to be a trip to read. Alright, so I've got some more reading in over the past 2 days, and both works are really starting to grow on me for very different reasons, of course. But starting with Red Pyramid, I'm 5 stories in now. I just finished, I think, one of the more prominent, or at least well-received stories within this collection called Nastya. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, the sharp turn in this story happens when we have this young girl. She's just turned 16 and she's received different gifts from family and family friends and the local priest and all of that. But then the sudden twist in the story occurs when later that evening she is chained up, bound tightly together to the shovel, which they shove in a Russian oven and cook her to perfection before serving her at this great feast with a bunch of different attendees as the primary course, where they feast on her various body parts. Now, where the story goes from there is much more ideologically driven. And there's a couple ways probably to dissect this story and explore it. But specifically, the Nietzschean philosophy is kind of the core piece of this story, where they're examining this idea of overcoming, because the father, before she's consents to being roasted in this Russian oven, is he asks her, like, are you willing to overcome? Have you read Nietzsche's philosophy? And then they discuss it later at the party. Now, there is one attendee that aggressively rejects these Nietzschean values, and he says, quote, "No, this is total delirium, a general state of lunacy, the second dimming of our minds. First there was Hegel, to whom my grandfather literally prayed, and now this mustache fool." And he goes on to reference different Dostoevsky characters, which, if you're familiar with reading Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, you know that there's a lot of existential themes and questions that overlap into each of their works. So he references Raskolnikov and Stavrogin, and just overall, points out all the errors and flaws in this logic or this thinking within Nietzschean philosophy. But part of this is not just criticizing Nietzschean philosophy, but also, I think, the idea of kind of collectivism overall, but this idea of self-sacrifice, or sacrificing the weak for the strength and the nurturing of the strong. But these ideologies, especially when they become so fanatical, they can get this vice grip on the people within said society to a point where they will just submit and gleefully submit to this kind of self-sacrifice. For example, Irina, who is also a young girl in attendance here at this feast and was friends with Nastya, she's pleading, she's like upset that she has to wait for her turn. She says, quote, "All of my friends have already been roasted and I'm still waiting." And then later you have that same character who criticized Nietzschean philosophy. He adds, quote, "There have already been attempts to create just this sort of healthy society. Think of Sparta, and how did that end? Every society that kicks the fallen when they're down ends up falling itself." And another thing you have to keep in mind with this story is that it's set in 1899, so right at the turn of the century, before the 1905 revolution, before the Bolshevik Revolution. Yet, what Sorokin is kind of doing here is prophesizing a little bit, because the same character who's making all these criticisms, Mahmut, he is referencing demagoguery. and mentioning that there is this Messiah likely to come, or one of the characters is expecting some Messiah that's supposed to kind of uplift the society, be this Ubermensch type figure that Nietzsche is famous for conceptualizing. And what is that? Who is that demagogue that's coming? Vladimir Lenin, Trotsky as well, and all these kind of very, again, prominent, bombastic speakers and leaders of these movements that are supposed to bring about prosperity and general well-being. But of course, that is not the reality of what happens. It's empty promises and tons of violence and destruction. So overall, I found there's a lot of value in that story. There's also earlier on when they were eating her, there was a little bit of kind of playing around with the ethical dilemma of eating living beings and eating animals. And there is this kind of hypocrisy as they're eating their own species and talking about the need to eat eat living beings, and whether suffering matters, whether eating like a plant versus a pig that can squeal and things like that. So a lot of layers to that story that you can dig into, and I'm curious to see what I make of the rest of the stories. For me, Sorokin's story is a lot of ups and downs. The commonality between all of them is they all involve feces generally, but again, highs and lows with his stories. I'm continuously intrigued by him. But as far as Peter the First, this story is finally starting to get moving. He's finally seized control, which if you aren't familiar, for the longest time, it was his older sister, Sophia, who was essentially leading the country as kind of like an unofficial czar. And she was whispering and kind of guiding her younger brothers, Ivan and Pyotr, as they were kind of co-czars, so to speak. But he's seized full control at this point. He's grown older. And he's starting to look at Russia as a society, and he's very unhappy with what he sees. The reputation of Russia compared to Western Europe is they believe that they're just a bunch of heathens, a bunch of barbarism in the country, thieves and liars, and also they're just, again, technologically behind. They don't have great trade routes. They're not big exporters of different goods, and he wants to change that. He's looking at his country, he's upset, and I think there's a great quote here where one of his advisors, this Frenchman, Lefort, I believe is how it's pronounced, says, quote, well, actually, I'll read the quote before it to add some context. So Pyotr says, abroad people don't steal, don't plunder. Are people there of some different breed? And Lefort advises him and says, the people are the same, Pyotr Alexeyevich, but thieving doesn't pay. Honesty pays better. They look after the merchants, and the merchants look after themselves. My father came to Russia under the last Tsar. He built a factory in Tula and wanted to work honestly. They wouldn't let him. They ruined him by all kinds of obstruction and delay. Here, if a man is not a thief, then he must be a fool, and honor lies not in being honorable, but in being exalted above others. Yet we too have clever men. So essentially, Pyotr finds himself in a country rich in opportunity, rich in resources, large population, but they're not capitalizing on it. The people are starving, they're in deep poverty, there's a lot of thievery and murder and violence and just overall debauchery going on in the country. The church is quite unstable at this time. Other countries don't really respect them in the same way. And he has to take the right steps to kind of curb and change the culture, identity, and behavior and socio-behavioral dynamics of the country. And a specific part of that right now that he's looking to do is how to gain access to the Baltic Sea, so he can have drastically broaden out his trading ports, basically. And Pyotr himself also was very enthusiastic about seafaring. He was very fascinated about seafaring, shipbuilding, all of that. So I'm curious to see where the story goes, where history takes us. But overall, the story's starting to pick up a little bit. It is starting to pick up, and but it is slow. I will admit that unless you have some kind of deep interest and fascination with Russian history, this time period, it probably will feel like a slog. I can't say I'd recommend it to many of you. I'm about 230 pages in now, and I think most of you it'd be a good bedtime story to put you to sleep. But if you are a Slavophile, if you are interested in Russian history, it's probably a nice companion piece if you are reading about 17th century and the like. But before I close here, I did want to mention a book that I stumbled upon at my local bookstore. So my wife wanted to go to a local bookstore, grab a book that just released, and of course I meandered on with her, tagged along, and figured I'd see what had crept into the shop. And lo and behold, I was looking in the history section, and I found a neat little work called A Window on Russia by Edmund Wilson. And the title is in reference to Alexander Pushkin's Bronze Horseman story. It's in reference to a quote within that. And I'd never heard of Edmund Wilson, but funny enough, I feel like this happens with words, it happens with authors. I'd never heard of Edmund Wilson before, and then now that I start to look him up a little bit, I buy this book. Now I see his face everywhere. I hear about his other books. I hear about it in a YouTube video, and I'm like, I don't know. That just happens to me a lot, where it's like once you unlock a new author name or unlock a new vocabulary word, it's like you start hearing it all the time. So it's kind of one of those situations. But he is a 20th century literary critic. Has written a number of different works. But specifically, he also traveled to the Soviet Union. And so this book is neat, not just because he discusses his thoughts on very prominent Russian writers, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Pushkin, Gogol, and discusses their different works, but he also studied Russian, the language himself. So he has a number of passages in here about the Russian language. He includes different excerpts in Cyrillic, and discusses the kind of use of the language, what is being expressed there, how some of these stories are dependent on the fundamentals and logic of the Russian language. But overall, I'm really happy to find this because I didn't know it existed. I wasn't looking for it, but it almost feels like tailor-made for me at this point in my life, studying the language, being a huge fan of Russian literature. So I plan to read it here soon, and we'll let you guys know what I think. But going to read a few more stories from this collection, and then I'll follow up with you all tomorrow. So I just finished another story in this Red Pyramid collection called Horse Soup. So I figured I'd wrap up the video describing that and share maybe some final thoughts. I can't give final thoughts because I'm only halfway into the book. There's still stories to go, but at least final thoughts for this video on this collection. So Horse Soup follows this girl, Olga, who ends up getting paid and sorting out this deal with this former prisoner or former felon that she meets on a train. And the prisoner oddly pleads and just begs for her, or begs to watch her eat food. He wants to pay her just to watch her eat food. And when she does so, he starts like convulsing, and it's not like he like gets some kind of sexual pleasure or excitement out of it, but he almost is just starts convulsing, shuddering, sweating. He like keeps mumbling the words, this is nah, and very strange stuff as you'd come to expect with Sorokin. And so this goes on for a while. She is put off at first by it, but eventually accepts the offer to basically meet once a month and eat the food that he offers her, and he just watches. And so she does this over and over. Over time, he starts to change and like kind of cut the pieces of food into smaller portions. Eventually, the plate is only half full, and he has her start to eat invisible food, and so she starts acting like she's eating food, and he still gets the same kind of pleasure or stimulation from it. And then it gets to the point where she's eating an empty plate and just acting, essentially. And it gets really strange. And at this point, throughout this period of like 2 years that she's carrying out this deal with him, she's starting to indulge in more vices, living lavishly, partaking in all kinds of affairs, sometimes with married men. She's having abortions. So just kind of living, again, a bit more sensually and indulging in those vices. And another important factor about this prisoner is while he was in prison, he was forced to eat this horse soup. So eventually she starts calling him by the moniker, at least to herself, she calls him by the moniker Horse Soup. And at the time he describes how, he was only fed for, I think it was 6 years or 7 years he was in prison, and he was only fed one specific meal, and it was this horse soup. And he describes how it's made, but the interesting thing is later she ends up getting married, and she goes on this trip abroad to Europe. And at some point on the trip, she becomes intensely repulsed by the look and the smell of food. The abundance of food reeks of death. He references that a few times, that it has this like almost death or macabre like feeling that is evoked within her. So she can't eat for like weeks, and so she eventually returns back to Russia, and she's like, I gotta find this guy. And it turns into a wild ending, again, as you'd expect. But what I wonder is the fact that, you know, prisoners in these prison systems, whether it's Gulag or what this certain character was in, how he was forced to eat the same meal over and over. He was starved maybe at certain portions. And I wonder that over time, her like slowly eating less food, and then being repulsed by the food at the end is kind of, I wonder if there's something to that. Like, I need to continue to follow the logic, piece everything together and figure out, you know, what is this aversion to food coming from this almost prisoner instinct of, you know, you've been starved so long that food is like repulsive to you, or I don't know. I think there's something there I need to continuously think about, but the ending it feels almost utterly disconnected to it. His stories are just too experimental for me, to be honest. I'm curious to see when I get to his novels, Blue Lord, Telluria, the Ice Trilogy, and things like that, if they possess the same kind of just quirky, odd, you know, experimental components to them, or if they're a little bit more accessible and decipherable. I don't know. But so far, that was the story. That was Horse Soup. So again, something I was interested in from start to finish, but something that I walk away with and finish and flip the final page and I go, okay. You know, it's just I never know exactly what to make of Sorokin. Maybe I'll ask Anton and see if he has any guesses on that story, although he hasn't read a ton of Sorokin, just a few stories. But anyway, that is it for this video. A little bit of a vlog, a little bit all over the place, but hopefully you enjoyed it nevertheless. And let me know, have you guys read Sorokin? Are you curious? Does my description make you delete him from your TBR, or are you more inclined to pick him up? And also, you know, any thoughts on Peter the Great, Russian history, things like that, or even Edmund Wilson in that book I fortunately picked up. Let me know in the comments, what are you reading? What have you enjoyed lately? And like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe for more content, and I will see you all in the next one.